Right. Hi, everyone. We are going to be talking about the antebellum period today. What antebellum means is just a period before a war, and it's often used to describe the period before the Civil War. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be looking at slavery, some other political issues associated with slavery, and some reform movements that sort of lead up to the time of the Civil War. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Right. So we're going to start with the reforming spirit that we see in the 1800s in this antebellum period. And what we mean by reform is social reforms, which is an organized attempt to improve what is unjust or imperfect in a society. So some more familiar social reform movements would be something like the civil rights movement, trying to improve society. We see something that is imperfect in society, in this case, segregation. And so we want to make that a little bit better. So the reforms that we're going to be seeing in this antebellum period have two major roots. First are the political roots, and those come mainly from people starting to question slavery and women's rights. We talked about a few times ago that we see the expansion of things like suffrage in this period, but there were a lot of groups that were left out of that equality. So those are going to be slaves and women. We also have some religious roots. So the major example here is the Second Great Awakening, a spiritual revival all throughout the United States, where people are starting to think about free will, morality issues, and salvation for all people. So that goes to slaves as well. So we have a lot of people thinking morally, thinking about political issues related to slavery and women's rights, things like that. And so that's all going to culminate into a lot of different reform movements. All right. So some of the early reforms that we see happening here are going to be for mental health. Um, we have people who are basically criminalized for having mental health issues. If you have schizophrenia, bipolar disease, even depression in some cases, people would be put in prison because nobody knew how to deal with those mental health issues. And so there were a lot of efforts to create mental health hospitals, places where people could actually get treatment. And so people start treating mental health issues as a physical ailment, kind of a health issue rather than a criminal issue. So that's a big reform. Another reform is for the prison system in the United States. Before, prisoners were treated very poorly. I mean, they're still going to be treated pretty poorly after the reforms, but less so than how they were before. Things like people being locked in caves. For prisons. So we start to build prisons and treat our prisoners a little bit more humanely. We also get the temperance movement beginning here in the 1800s in the antebellum period. The temperance movement is a campaign against alcohol abuse. A lot of people associated really negative behaviors with alcohol, especially abuse and different things like that. And so people started to say, maybe we shouldn't have alcohol allowed in our society. And so we're going to see a big push to reduce alcohol use, educate people about what happens when you use alcohol, and eventually it will culminate into prohibition, making the use of alcohol illegal all throughout the United States, and that won't be until we get the 18th Amendment later on in the 20th century. But the temperance movement begins here in the antebellum period. And then we have a lot of education reforms as well, the creation of public schools. A lot of people didn't have access to education up until this point. And so schools are built. These are going to be one-room schoolhouses. And public education is going to be provided for many communities, at least through elementary school. Usually, you had to pay for education beyond that, but still, spreading education and literacy throughout the population. You want, especially if you have a lot of voters, you want your voting population to be educated so they can make informed, good decisions for the country. So those are some of our early reforms. But we're going to get into two major movements from this period: the abolition movement and the women's rights movement. So we're going to start with abolition. So this is an 1800s movement for racial equality, and the major goal here is to end slavery. Now, a lot of people are going to be participating from all over the country, from all walks of life. We're going to see a lot of religious opposition to slavery. We talked about the Second Great Awakening sort of inspiring people to re-examine the morality of slavery. So we're going to get a lot of Quakers and other Christians who are going to campaign against slavery in the United States. We also have a lot of sectionalism associated with this movement. In 1800, there were about 50,000 slaves in the North, while in the South we had about 1 million slaves. So this is going to become a sectional issue as well, where we have the North overall against slavery and the South overall in favor of slavery. And eventually, there won't be any slaves in the northern states. We also get an organization called the American Colonization Society, and this is a group that set up a colony in Africa for freed slaves. And that colony is going to be Liberia. Liberia is in West Africa, right about here. And so they set up that colony specific for freed slaves to go and live. And we're going to see only a few thousand African Americans settle in Liberia over time. But we'll see later on a movement begins with Marcus Garvey called the Back to Africa movement later on in the 1900s. And so this idea of Africans going back to Africa is going to hold throughout the 1800s. And so the people who are part of this abolition movement are called abolitionists, a person who wanted to end slavery. So just like with any movement, you're going to have sort of a gradient of people who are in favor of some things, against other things. So in the case of the abolitionists, you had some people who were in favor of sort of a gradual end to slavery. If we can just keep it out of the Western states, slavery will eventually die out. Whereas others thought that it should be ended immediately. It's immoral, it's wrong. We should not have slaves in this country. And so they wanted to put an end to slavery immediately. So you're going to have different groups that will sort of be subsets of this abolition movement. You're going to get a lot of different people participating as well. You'll have free African Americans trying to end slavery through things like lawsuits and petitions, trying to get legislation passed, different things like that. But a lot of them set up their own newspapers to spread stories of slavery and to really showcase the horrors of what slavery was all about and the experience of the slaves to try to get sympathy from people. And then we have a couple of major players in the abolition movement. One of those people is going to be Frederick Douglass. He was born a slave in Maryland, and he illegally learned how to read, illegally because slaves were not allowed to learn how to read. And he ends up actually writing a story of his life called The Narrative of Frederick Douglass, outlining just his experience as a slave. And eventually, he becomes a very important public speaker for the abolition movement. He opened his own anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star. He was a very influential American, not just for abolition, but for civil rights in general. So this is Frederick Douglass right here. We also have whites who are participating in the abolition movement as well. William Lloyd Garrison was a really outspoken white abolitionist from New England, and he ran a newspaper as well called The Liberator. And he helped found the New England Anti-Slavery Society. So we're going to have a lot of white people who are participating in abolition as well. And then we have the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, born to a slaveholder, but they grew up hating slavery. They saw firsthand what it was like. And so they're going to participate not just in the abolition movement, but in the women's movement as well. They were fierce abolitionists, and as they were questioning what was happening to slaves, they also started to question what was happening for their own gender, women's rights. If we're trying to get equality for African Americans, what about women? Women should be treated equally as well. Okay. Major part of the abolition movement was the Underground Railroad. So this was not underground and not a railroad, but it's called that because it's kind of a secret network of abolitionists who would help slaves escape to freedom. And so you would have different stations along this network. Where you'd have homes, people's personal homes, stores, churches, even caves, different things like that, where escaped slaves could stay for the night, get food, get supplies, and then the conductors or the helpers that ran these stations would guide the slaves to the next safe house, give them directions, and help them get where they need to be. So one of the most famous conductors is Harriet Tubman, of course. She's pictured right here. She escaped slavery herself and then came back to the South 19 times to help over 300 slaves escape from slavery. She even served in the Civil War, leading a Black group of soldiers to fight against the whites and to help preserve people's rights and help them escape slavery even further. In the end, there was a $40,000 reward for her capture. So Harriet Tubman is a big abolitionist, major figure in American history. Now, there's going to be a lot of opposition to abolition. In the North, some people are opposed to abolition as well. So these people are going to be merchants, people who work in the mills, banks. And these people all depend on the cotton from the South, which is grown by the slaves and harvested by the slaves. And so they view the ending of slavery as a threat to their income. So they're going to be against abolition. You also have factory workers in the North who are afraid of African Americans coming up and taking their jobs because African Americans would be willing to work for lower wages at that time. And so they could undercut white factory workers for those jobs potentially. And so you're going to get some opposition there as well. And then, of course, in the South, a lot of opposition to abolition. They feared that the abolitionist movement was preaching violence. They feared slave revolts. There were a couple of slave revolts. Nat Turner and David Walker led some revolts, which struck fear throughout the South. Southerners know how they're treating the slaves. They know the abuse that is being imparted on these people, and so they're afraid that if slaves learn how to read, if they're given guns, if they're given any inkling of hope, that they will rise up against them and kill them, which did happen in some instances. And then, of course, slavery is absolutely essential to the Southern economy. And they're worried that Northerners want to destroy their Southern way of life. So there's going to be a lot of pushback from the South. All right, moving on to our next movement is the women's rights movement. Now, in the 1800s, women did not have equal status with men. They couldn't vote or hold office. Husbands owned all the property in the family, and if a woman had a job outside of the home, her wages were the property of her husband as well. She had no right to that money, keeping it for herself. Husbands could also legally hit their wives, so women didn't have a lot of recourse if they were in an abusive marriage. So that's going to be a problem for women as well. And a lot of women participated in the abolitionist movement. That's kind of where they got their start, learning how to organize social movements. And so a lot of people started to work towards equal rights for themselves, like I said before with the Grimke sisters. And women had very little formal education. Many women couldn't read. They would learn things like dancing and drawing instead of math and science, which were considered to be men's subjects. So that's going to be a big part of the women's movement as well, trying to gain education, basic things like reading that women want to have. Right, and there's going to be a couple of key leaders here. The Grimke sisters that we mentioned before will participate. Sojourner Truth, a Black woman born to slavery. She was Dutch, and she ended up going all over the country speaking out for women's rights. And she actually delivers a really famous speech called "Aren't I a Woman?" Talking about even though she is Black, she's still a woman, and she still deserves the respect that women might receive at this point. A man opening a door for a woman, bowing to her, helping her across the street, something like that. So she was a major advocate for not just abolition, but also women's rights. And then you have Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who are going to be our leaders for the Seneca Falls Convention, which we'll talk about in a second here. Both of them very good at organizing, had a lot of exposure to the abolitionist movement. And so they're going to use that knowledge and that experience to help lead this women's rights movement. And this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton here. She's actually married to an abolitionist, Henry Stanton. Okay. So the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, takes place in New York. About 200 women attended, with 40 men in attendance as well. And they did a couple of things. The first one is pretty major. They approved a Declaration of Sentiments, which was basically a statement about their goals and about equality for women. And they actually used some of the lines from the Declaration of Independence and altered those. We have this really famous one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. So it said things like that. They also voted on resolutions to grant equality in various places in society, at work, at school, and in church, giving women more rights and equality there. They voted on a resolution demanding the right to vote, something that wasn't very popular at the time. It barely passed as a resolution, but that will gain traction as we go into the second half of the 1800s. And so the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 is often seen by historians as the beginning of the women's rights movement, this organized campaign for equal rights. And it's going to continue all the way into the 1960s and 70s, where we'll see women's rights really take off there. And we still have issues regarding women's rights, especially like equal pay. The Equal Rights Amendment has still not been passed by Congress. Issues over like abortion rights and different things like that are all things that are still part of what you could say is still the continuing women's rights movement. So those are all things that we still deal with today. And then I just wanted to mention one other leader of the women's rights movement, Susan B. Anthony, women's rights leader. She went all across the nation giving speeches like a lot of the other leaders. And even when audiences interrupted her and threw things at her, she carried on. So she was seen as a very strong figure. But she'll be a little bit more important in the later stages of the women's rights movement. Okay. No, the movement was very successful in the antebellum period. New York eventually passed a law allowing women to keep their wages and property, and they made a lot of gains in education. They saw education as the window for equality. If a woman can't read, how is she going to be equal to a man? If a woman isn't educated in basic skills, how is she going to be equal to a man? And so education was a big push for the women's rights movement here in the 1800s. A lot of reformers opened schools for girls to learn those men's subjects like math and science. One school called the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary was the first women's college in the United States. Some men's colleges even began to admit women, and women started finding jobs in all types of fields, teachers, in astronomy, journalism, theology, and they continued to participate in reform movements like abolition, temperance, and their own movement. We even have one woman, Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman in the U.S. to graduate with a medical degree and founded the first medical school for women. So a lot of success for the women's rights movement. All right, we have this political cartoon here. You can see here this river going into the waterfall has a couple of things written in it. 1776, so that's a reference to the American Revolution and how women started to question their own place in society as Americans were talking about freedom and liberty and equality. Women started to say, well, what about us? We should be included in that as well. We have the market revolution here in the early 1800s. That's a reference to women sort of joining this workforce outside of the home. We talked about industrialization and women starting to work in factories and textile mills and things like that. And so that helped women sort of see themselves as a more important gender in society. We have the Second Great Awakening, which of course is dealing with those moral issues and is encouraging a lot of these reform movements. And then right up here, we have the abolitionist movement, another stepping stone for women to get involved in this greater women's movement. Okay, and all of these are going to help women get down here to equality. All right, and we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who are paddling with their pens and writing the Declaration of Sentiments, that really important document from the Seneca Falls Convention. And we see some of the successes of this movement towards equality. We see some employment, education, suffrage, which is women's right to vote, and property rights, which we just talked about as some major successes for the women's movement. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton is saying, hang on, ladies, it's going to be a bumpy ride, but it will be worth it. A long, bumpy ride for American women, like I said, going all the way into the 60s and 70s today. All right. Okay, so we're going to get into some issues with slavery now, moving away from the reform movements and into these political complications that are going to help lead us to the actual Civil War. It's going to start here with the Missouri Compromise. Now, Missouri had applied for statehood in 1819 to join the Union of States. And at this point, we've got 11 free states and 11 slave states, which means that if we admit Missouri to the Union, that's going to change the balance of those slave and free states. And with each state, of course, you have senators, you have state representatives as well. And so that's going to change the makeup of the Senate. So if we're talking about senators here, if Missouri is allowed to come into the Union as a slave state, then now in Congress, you're going to have 2 extra people who are going to be voting for things to do with slavery. And so the North was very opposed to adding Missouri. They didn't want the balance in the Senate to change. And that's going to be at the heart of all of these issues that we're going to be talking about here. So Henry Clay, our great champion for compromise, as we've seen before, suggests the Missouri Compromise. And in the Missouri Compromise, Missouri would be added to the Union as a slave state. Maine, who is also applying for statehood around the same time, would be added as a free state. And so that balance between free and slave states would be maintained with the Missouri Compromise. Furthermore, he said that slavery would be allowed south of the 3630 North line of latitude in the Louisiana Territory. And so that line is the southern border of Missouri. So anything south of that southern border, you could have slaves. Anything north of it, slavery would be outlawed. And it only affected the land in the Louisiana Purchase, all that territory. So if we look at this map here, the Louisiana Territory is roughly this section here in the center. So we have our yellow states here are all going to be slave states and territories. Our green states are going to be our free states and territories. And then this territory up here would be closed to slavery according to the Missouri Compromise. And this territory down here in purple would be open to slavery because here is our 3630 line, southern border of the state of Missouri. So anything south of that could be slave states. Anything north of that could be free states. Okay. And then, of course, Missouri is the exception to that. They're going to be a slave territory. Okay. Now, we get some people who are very opposed to the expansion of slavery in the West, beyond just abolitionists. And they are going to form a political party called the Free Soil Party in 1848. And like I said, their major goal is to keep slavery from expanding to the West. Now, this doesn't mean that they want to end slavery in the South. So that's different than the abolitionists. They just don't want it spreading further out into these new Western territories and states that we're seeing created. So they play a major role in the election of 1848. We get 3 major candidates in this election for president. Martin Van Buren, who is going to be our Free Soil Party representative. He is pictured here on this Free Soil Party flyer or banner. He wanted to ban slavery in the Mexican Cession. So if you remember, Mexican Cession was that territory in the Southwest New Mexico, Arizona, California. And so he doesn't want slavery to happen in that territory. Lewis Cass is going to be our next candidate, a Democrat. He's going to be from Michigan, actually. And he is going to support popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty in this case is referring to the right of the people to decide for themselves if they wanted slavery or not in their territory. So for him, it's not really about stopping slavery from being in those territories. It's more about if we have, in the case of Missouri, if we have people in Missouri, they should be able to vote for their own state if they want to have slavery or not. It shouldn't be up to Congress to decide where slavery can and cannot be. So that's Lewis Cass's position. And then Zachary Taylor, a Whig, didn't address the issue at all about slavery, but he did own slaves himself. And if you remember, Zachary Taylor was one of our leaders in the Mexican-American War. All right. So the results of the election of 1848 is that Taylor wins the presidency. So even though the Free Soilers didn't gain power, they did take 10% of the popular vote and gained 13 seats in Congress. So this is a big deal in 1848. And what it tells us is that the success of the Free Soilers here shows us that slavery had become a national issue. And so for the next 12 years, until we get to the Civil War, this is going to be a major national conversation and debate that will sometimes erupt into violence. And then, of course, culminating in the absolute violence of the Civil War. All right, we're going to get another compromise happening here in 1850. And if you remember from westward expansion, California applied for statehood in 1850. And we talked a little bit about this issue about whether it can be a slave state or a free state. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail here. Now, in 1849, we've got 15 free states and 15 slave states. So again, we are balanced in Congress. Things are nice and even, but now we get some new territories that want to be states. And so are they going to come in as free or are they going to come in as slave states? So California is our big one here. Most of California is north of that 3630 north latitude line. And so technically, according to the Missouri Compromise, California should be admitted as a free state. Oregon and Utah would also fall into that category. And then we have New Mexico, who also wants to join. But they are south of the line, and so they want to join as free states. And so, of course, Southerners are afraid of being outnumbered in Congress and having those issues come up over slavery. And we even get an instance where one of the senators from Mississippi, Senator Foote, pulls a gun out on the Senate floor and aims it at another senator from Missouri. Senator Benton from Missouri says, "Go ahead and shoot me, you assassin." No shots ended up being fired, but this is kind of a culmination of people start snapping over this issue of slavery. And we'll see another issue in the Senate in a second here too. So some Southerners, in the face of this California question and some of these other territories, suggest to secede from the Union, which means they're going to leave or remove themselves from the United States. And if you guys remember, a big outspoken person for that was John C. Calhoun, former vice president under Andrew Jackson, and later becomes a senator in the South for Carolina. So he insisted that slavery be allowed in the West. He demanded that fugitive slaves or runaway slaves be returned to the South and threatened to secede from the Union if Congress did not comply with these demands. But a lot of people thought that if the South seceded, if they tried to separate, they couldn't do so peacefully. There would be no question that there would be a civil war. And a civil war is a war between people of the same country. So in this case, it's going to be our North versus the South. And then another person who was outspoken about slavery, Daniel Webster, thought that even though slavery was evil, he felt that the breakup of the U.S. would be even worse than the evil of slavery. And so he supported Southern demands about fugitive slaves and some of their other issues in order to keep them from seceding and ending in a civil war. All right, so this is the Compromise of 1850 here. What it does is it admits California as a free state. It upholds popular sovereignty in New Mexico and Utah. So California is going to come in free. New Mexico and Utah are going to vote for themselves. Do they want slavery there or do they not? It's going to ban the slave trade in Washington, D.C., so you can't buy or sell slaves anymore in Washington. And it also included the Fugitive Slave Act, all right, which I have some information over here. So the Fugitive Slave Act required all people to help catch fugitive slaves. So if you see someone walking down the street who you think is a slave, you could probably tell if their hair is matted, if they have ripped clothing, they're dirty, probably an escaped slave. And so if you see someone, you have to report them and send them back to the South. And people who helped slaves escape could be fined up to $1,000. Suspected slaves were denied a trial. They're not U.S. citizens, they're property at this point. And so judges had a lot of incentive to send them back to the South. If a judge sent a slave back to the South, they earned $10. If the judge freed them and said, go about your business, you can be in the North here, he earned only $5. So there was some political and economic sort of motivation for sending slaves back to the South. And it created a greater divide between North and South. A lot of Northerners were basically forced to participate in the slavery system by having this mandate that they had to turn slaves in if they knew that they were escaped. And so it angered a lot of Northerners, and they became more outspoken against slavery. And then one last thing to mention about the Compromise of 1850, it helped settle a border dispute between Texas and New Mexico. So that was just one other part of it. All right. Another step towards civil war and people being super against slavery was this novel that was published in 1852 called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a white woman from New England. She had very little exposure to slavery firsthand, but she did, hear the stories. And her story, Uncle Tom's Cabin, highlights the brutality of slavery. Just showing people and exposing people, especially in the North, to the issues of slavery. So it becomes extremely popular, sells out in 2 days, and eventually sold millions of copies to rival sales of the Bible. And it later becomes one of the most important books in American history. And it helps shift slavery from just a political problem to a moral problem. People start seeing that slaves are experiencing all kinds of abuse. They're experiencing starvation in some cases, rape in some cases, really horrible treatment and difficulties working in the fields and different things like that. So people start saying, wow, this is really bad. We probably shouldn't allow this to continue in our country. And so it creates a sense of urgency to end slavery and added to this anti-slavery mood that we see happening in the North. So people become more outspoken against slavery. Okay. Another issue over territories is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's introduced by Senator Stephen Douglas, who we'll talk about again later on. And what it did was divided the Nebraska Territory, which was a big northern chunk of the Louisiana Purchase, into 2 territories, Kansas and Nebraska. And the settlers of the territory would decide the issue of slavery for themselves. So this would be popular sovereignty. So they could vote if they wanted to have slaves or not. A lot of support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act comes from Southerners. They think that the people in Kansas and Nebraska will vote in favor of slavery in their territory. They supported popular sovereignty, which was used in the Compromise of 1850. And it seemed fair to them. It had the support of President Franklin Pierce at the time. And so a lot of Southerners hoped that slaveholders from Missouri would move into the Kansas and Nebraska territories and vote to turn it into a slave state. Now, a lot of opposition to the Nebraska Act came from mostly Northerners. So again, we're seeing this sectionalism happen. According to the Missouri Compromise, slavery was already banned in those territories, the Kansas and Nebraska territories. And so they felt that the Kansas-Nebraska Act would repeal the Missouri Compromise, something that they had worked very hard to get into place. And so, especially the part of the North that had won in the compromise, those people are going to be against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right, so if we look at our map here, here is our Missouri Compromise line, 3630, all right, the southern border of Missouri. And so according to that compromise, anything north of that line in this Louisiana Purchase territory should be free. And so you can see where those people would be against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Green is all free territories that we have now, or states. We have our slave states in the South. And then these two territories, Utah and New Mexico, are going to be opened for slavery because that's what they ended up voting for as a result of the Compromise of 1850. And so the fear here is that Kansas and Nebraska would open up for slavery as well, which they're going to vote for later on. So we see this eruption of violence in Kansas and the Senate as a result of this Kansas-Nebraska Act. Pro-slavery settlers, just like the South predicted, moved into the territory, as well as abolitionists. They all move into Kansas and Nebraska in hopes of swaying the vote. So pro-slavery settlers are going to vote for slavery. Abolitionists, of course, are going to vote against the slavery in those territories. We also get a group called border ruffians. These are going to be the pro-slavery groups. They ride over the Missouri border into Kansas and Nebraska to intimidate local settlers. And in 1855, hundreds of border ruffians crossed into Kansas and voted illegally in favor of slavery. So they elect a pro-slavery government and pass laws against the abolitionists. And of course, people who were abolitionists refused to accept the election results because they know that those people voted illegally. And so they decided to elect their own government in Kansas. So we have these two rival governments happening and a lot of chaos associated with that. So we get this outbreak of violence, and Kansas comes to be called Bleeding Kansas. There was a band of pro-slavery men who raided the town of Lawrence, Kansas, destroyed homes and property. So that's on the pro-slavery side. On the anti-slavery side, we get violence as well. A man named John Brown, who's an abolitionist, takes a group of men and rides into Pottawatomie Creek and dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers out of their homes and murdered them. So there's a lot of violence in this area. And then we also get gangs engaging in hit and run tactics, killing over 200 people by the time we get to 1856. So a lot of violence in this area. We also see violence in the Senate happening. A man named Charles Sumner, who was a Massachusetts senator, a leading abolitionist, gave a very scathing speech criticizing opponents of abolition. And he particularly targeted another senator, Andrew Butler, who was from South Carolina. And so Butler's nephew gets wind of this. His name was Preston Brooks, and he walks into the Senate and attacks Charles Sumner on the Senate floor with a cane and beats him almost to death. Sumner ended up surviving, but he gets beat up pretty bad by Preston Brooks. So you can see in this picture here, here's Preston Brooks with his cane, beating the crap out of Charles Sumner here. And a lot of people who supported Brooks sent him canes to show their support for slavery as well. So a lot of chaos and uncertainty during this time. Okay. Another step towards civil war is going to come in the form of the Dred Scott case, a Supreme Court case called Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who lived in Missouri. He and his owner eventually moved to Illinois and then Wisconsin, where slavery was outlawed. And so Dred Scott felt that he should have been free. after living in those free territories. Eventually, he returns to Missouri. His owner dies there, and he decides to file a case saying that since he had lived in those free states, he had become a free man. And so the case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules against Dred Scott. They say Dred Scott is not allowed to file a lawsuit to begin with because he's not a citizen. He is property as a slave. So he doesn't have any rights to even make this case. And then their second part of their ruling was that Congress didn't have the power to outlaw slavery in any of the territories, which makes the Missouri Compromise, our first one that we saw, unconstitutional. So Congress can't even make a statement about slavery in those territories. So we get two different reactions. Southerners, of course, are going to be really happy about this. This case means that slavery is legal in all the territories, regardless of any of these compromises that we've looked at up to this point. Northerners are upset because they felt that eventually, if we can keep slavery out of the West, that it would eventually die out. And the court erased any sense of progress that Northerners had been making towards ending slavery. So they were pretty upset about the outcome of this case. And again, this is a step towards civil war. We have these sectional issues where we'd found compromises now being set aside, and so now it's just sort of North versus South, slavery versus non-slavery. Okay. We eventually get the evolution of the Republican Party in 1854. And this is going to be made up of people who are opposed to slavery in the territories, so that's the West, and some abolitionists. We're also going to see free soilers who would join with the Republican Party. And free soilers are going to get together with Northern Democrats and anti-slavery Whigs and form the official Republican Party in Michigan. And their major goal is to keep slavery out of the Western territories. So again, this is not abolition, which is getting rid of slavery altogether. This is just dealing with the Western territories, very similar to the free soilers. So the Republican stance is going to come to a head in what are called the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. So we have Abraham Lincoln coming on the scene here as a Republican from Illinois, and he is running for the U.S. Senate seat against Stephen Douglas, who was a Democrat. Over the course of 1858, they debated 7 different times, and the main issue they were discussing was slavery. Douglas personally disliked slavery, but supported popular sovereignty in the territories. Those territories should be able to vote if they want slavery in their states or not. Lincoln, on the other hand, personally did not believe in perfect equality or abolition, but he did believe that slavery was wrong, and he opposed slavery in those territories. Eventually, Douglas wins the election to the Senate, but these debates put Lincoln on the national stage and are going to make him a national figure. And eventually he's going to run for president in 1860. Right. Before we get to that, though, we have one last major issue here with slavery, and that is John Brown's raid in 1859. This takes place at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Now, John Brown, who we mentioned before, he was one of the abolitionists in Kansas who dragged those 5 pro-slavery people out and murdered them. So he's a pretty radical figure as far as abolition goes. But he plans a raid on a federal arsenal, which is basically a gun warehouse. He wants to get all the guns, instill a revolt against slave owners, and he's hoping to arm the slaves and lead them in this armed revolt against their owners. And so Brown and his raiders captured the armory, but no one came to join in the revolt part. And so Robert E. Lee, who's going to be a major general in the Civil War, leads his men and kills 10 of John Brown's raiders, captures Brown himself, and eventually Brown is sentenced to death and executed for murder and treason. So a lot of people react to this raid differently. Northerners consider Brown to be a martyr. A martyr is someone who's willing to give up their life for a particular cause or belief, in this case, abolition. And they praised his devotion to the cause, sang songs to celebrate his efforts, basically saw him as a pretty positive figure, even though he was violent. Southerners, on the other hand, are repulsed. They feel like the North is crazy. They're supporting this guy who was really violent, and they're afraid that the North wants to destroy not just slavery, but their way of life in the South. And so John Brown's raid really solidifies that notion in the South. So this just further deepens the division between Northerners and Southerners, and is going to contribute again to the outbreak of the Civil War. Now we have the election of 1860. The Republican National Convention chooses Abraham Lincoln as their nominee for president, and the Democratic National Convention actually splits. The Democratic Party splits in two, where you get Northern Democrats who did not want to support slavery in the territories, and they're going to choose Stephen Douglas as their candidate. And then the Southern Democrats want to preserve and spread slavery, so they're going to choose a man named John Breckinridge. So we're going to have Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, and Abraham Lincoln all running in this election. Lincoln, of course, wins. And it was basically because there were more Northern voters than there were Southern voters. So the Northerners outnumbered the Southerners. The Southern votes didn't impact the election at all. Lincoln's name wasn't even on the ballot in 10 of the Southern states. But Lincoln won anyway. So you can imagine how the Southerners are going to react to this. They didn't even really get a say. Of course, by not putting Lincoln on the ballot, they kind of dig their own grave there. But they're not going to be happy with Abraham Lincoln as president. So Southerners believed that Lincoln's election meant that the South had no voice in the national government. So they felt it was their duty to leave the Union. They believed the North had placed an abolitionist in the White House and that the federal government is now going to work against them, against their economy built on slavery, and against their way of life. And so they start talking about secession and actually carrying through with it. So South Carolina is going to be the first state to secede. That was where our John C. Calhoun was from. The state secedes in December of 1860, the first state to go. And they are followed closely by Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, all secede by February of 1861. So within 3 months, all of those states had seceded from the Union, broke off. And those states form the Confederate States of America. So when we talk about the Confederacy, this is who we're talking about. And they elect their president as Jefferson Davis, who is pictured here. All right, so he's going to be the leader of their southern country, the Confederate States of America. So Lincoln gives his inaugural address on March 4th, 1861, after all these states have seceded from the Union. And he pledges that there's not going to be any war unless the South is the one to start it. He's very adamant about that. So the Confederates decide that they're going to seize federal property. Jefferson Davis orders Confederate forces to seize federal forts, post offices, and other federal buildings all throughout the South. And so Lincoln has a tough decision to make here. He can either admit that the states have a right to leave the Union, which he feels they really don't, or he can send troops to hold those forts, which would start a civil war and lose the other 8 slaveholding states who had not seceded just yet. So he has this really difficult choice to make. Do we acknowledge that these states have a right to just break off whenever they feel like it? Or do we keep them in the Union, risk losing other states, and start a civil war? So this is all going to come to a head at the Battle of Fort Sumter. And this is going to be the kickoff to the beginning of the Civil War. Fort Sumter was off the coast of South Carolina, and it was running low on food and supplies. And so, of course, the Confederates are trying to seize different forts. So Lincoln ships food to the fort and promises the South Carolina governor that there's no weapons being shipped there. It's just food for the soldiers. But the Confederates, of course, demand that the fort be surrendered to them. The major who was in charge of the fort, Major Robert Anderson, of course, refuses to give up the fort to the Confederates. And so the Confederates open fire on the fort. And eventually Anderson is forced to surrender April 13th, 1861. And so this taking of the fort at Fort Sumter um, was the beginning of the Civil War. And so we're going to see 4 years of just decimation between the North and the South, thousands of lives lost, and the carnage that will accompany that. Okay, so next time we'll actually be talking about the Civil War itself, and we'll get into those details. Thank you.